Hi, everyone. My name is Marcy Landsman. I'm the senior editor for Cancer Today, an online resource and magazine for cancer patients, survivors, and caregivers, which is published by the American Association for Cancer Research. Today, we are joined by Dr. Vinayak Prasad, who is an associate professor at the University of California, San Francisco. He is also a practicing hematologist-oncologist who typically reviews published studies to weigh the evidence in clinical trial design and studies and research. He has criticized metrics used for approving drugs. He has scrutinized conflicts of interest, and he has frequently spoken out about the exuberant cost of cancer drugs, costs that he contends don't necessarily correlate with drug benefit. He lays out this analysis in a book called Malignant: How Bad Policy and Bad Evidence Harm People with Cancer. We recently discussed this book in our book club for the winter quarter. I want to thank you, Dr. Prasad, for joining us for what I'm sure will be a very provocative discussion.
Thanks so much for having me, Marcy.
Yes. I wanted to ask a question about why you decided to write that book.
So I guess I should say, I am a hemonc doctor, and I've been in this space for a while now. And my research has always been interested in health policy. How do we approve drugs? How do we pay for drugs? How do we get drugs to patients? The gaps between what we see in trials and what we see in our clinics. And I had been doing work on all these fronts. We've been publishing papers in a bunch of academic journals, and I had increasingly been using social media, where I found myself occasionally, getting some pushback from someone in this space. Somebody may disagree with some part of this. And it was a colleague of mine, a faculty member at Sloan Kettering, Sean Mylan-Cody, who told me that, one of the reasons why I think you're getting pushback is people only see a part of the argument. They see your paper on surrogate endpoints. They see your paper on cost. They have some objections there, but nobody gets to see the whole lay of the land, see how all these parts of the system actually come together, intertwine, and create the problem. And maybe if you laid it all out in a single place, like a book, people would get what you're saying. And so I think that was the impetus to write the book. And I actually think that he may have been right. And so I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah, I think too with Twitter, and you kind of speak in sound bites. Obviously, you've published research on these topics, but do you think you've become kind of a controversial figure in some circles? I would say, or provocative, maybe might be a better word. But do you think the book gave you a better way to also describe sort of the pros and cons? Because as I was reading the book, you don't necessarily indict. You do mention accelerated approval programs and how they are important in certain cases. You kind of lay those statements out, but those are more difficult, I think, to discuss in a Twitter feed or any of that. So
I think you're right. I mean, yeah. Any good argument has nuance, and Twitter has no nuance. And Twitter has no nuance because of the way the format is. And it's not just about, cancer drug policy. It's any space from politics to COVID to, you name it. There's no nuance there, and it's difficult to get it. And the algorithm rewards, I think, extremism, and it pushes to sort of extreme views, and people are the least charitable readers on Twitter. So, I mean, I'll agree with you wholeheartedly. Social media is not a great place for dialogue. A book is a better place. And a book, especially, one of the things one of the points you make is do some people disagree with parts of this argument? Sure. That's naturally the case, I think, when you take on a multi-billion-dollar industry where there's so many people whose careers, their livelihoods, their whole 20-year, 30-year, 40-year career has been sort of complicit with the system. And if you are questioning of that, of course, they're going to not like that. But I think it's difficult for people to push back when they've read the whole book. And I think that the book has also been able to persuade a lot of people who are neophytes, who are trainees, who are just entering the field, and they read it without all that baggage, and they say, yeah, this is pretty spot on. So I think it has served, I think, what my purpose is, which is to try to persuade people.
I think the book kind of goes into a number of details, but I'd like to start first with accelerated approvals, because I think some people, patients specifically, who are our audience, may not really understand accelerated approvals. I mean, it sounds like exciting. It's an accelerated approval. I guess, can you talk a little bit about the accelerated approval program, which it did, I think it started in 1992 as a way to speed drugs to more people with serious illness, and it's to meet an unmet need. So what do you feel are the strengths of the program, as well as obviously the weaknesses, which you talk a lot about in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should always enter these conversations, remind ourselves, what do patients really want? I think patients they want more options, that's for sure. They want more drugs to help them. But those options, they want them to be good options. They want them to be drugs that improve their survival or improve their quality of life. And the regulator's job is to ensure that drugs that enter the US marketplace are safe and effective. And by effective, I think what we mean by that is that when used in the American populace, we actually benefit people. People live longer, live better. There are two paths to drug approval. One is the accelerated pathway. The other is the regular or traditional pathway. The traditional pathway has been there a long time. It has certain criteria for what does it mean to be safe and effective. The accelerated pathway came on the scene in 92, as you point out, really in the wake of HIV/AIDS. And the impetus there was that we are willing to accept more risk even if you don't know for sure the drugs are beneficial, because we don't have a lot of options right now. And so the pathway was always intended to be a provisional marketing authorization. You get to have your product on the market, provisional, but you got to later show it actually does what we think it does. And it has to fulfill an unmet need. It has to go someplace in medicine where there aren't a lot of options, where things are dire, where it wouldn't be so easy to do that great study right off the bat. I think those are sort of the key philosophical components to accelerated approval. And I should be clear, I have nothing against the philosophical idea of accelerated approval. I do think there are places in oncology where the condition is dire and rare and you don't have options. And it is reasonable to let these drugs on the market temporarily while you sort out whether or not it works. But in order for me to think that that's fair, you can't call everything unmet need. I mean, not every single thing can be unmet need. If you use it for everything, then I think it loses its meaning. You have to actually enforce the commitment. If the drug doesn't work, after it's on the market, you can't just vote to keep it on the market forever. At some point, you got to show people live longer, live better. And we have a difficult time, as we saw with the April ODAC, to do that. So, I mean, I guess that's how I would define accelerated approval. The last thing to point out is, I think we get so caught up in accelerated or regular, we should remember that half of the approvals that the FDA gives regular approval, they still use surrogate endpoints. They still use endpoints that aren't really direct measures of living longer, living better. We can talk about that.
Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about surrogate endpoints, because that's another subject that people may not understand. You have a whole chapter on that. Talk about some of the more common ones, progression-free survival, for example. Just define that briefly. I don't want to get too far into it because I know it's just a definition, but in case people don't know what that means.
Sure. I think, if you're somebody who has metastatic cancer, you don't want the doctor to tell you it has progressed. You don't want the doctor to come in and say it's getting considerably larger, even though we're giving you these therapies. I think that's what the patient understands by progression-free survival. But progression-free survival in clinical trials is a very formalized endpoint. It's not the same as, I think, what happens in the clinic. It literally is the time from when patients enroll in the study until one of several things happen. One, there's new spots on the scan. Well, of course, nobody wants that. Two, the time until the patient might pass away. Of course, nobody wants that. Or the time until the tumors get 20% bigger than the smallest they ever were. And that's really the bulk of it, the 20% bigger than the smallest it ever was. Do patients, and that to me is the crux of the issue. It's not that the tumors are getting bigger. They can get 19% bigger and you have stable disease. It's not that the patient felt worse. The tumors could be 134% and the patient might still feel great. It's that it's 120% or more. It's an arbitrary radiographic cut point that really, I think lacks justification. And that's what progression-free survival means in a trial. It's different than than a patient coming in feeling worse and the doctor saying the tumor has progressed in the clinic. That's different than, I think, the trial construct of PFS, the time until, new spots, death, or 20% bigger than the smallest it ever was for the tumors.
I know you mentioned it's an arbitrary number, but you need a number, right? I mean, there has to be some measure in which you can sort of hold some standardization? Like, is there a better way to determine that, or just not use progression-free survival ever?
Well, I guess it has different uses. I'll tell you some of the uses. One use is doctors use progression to decide when to switch drugs. So that's one use. It has some utility there, but there are a lot of drugs that, we continue even beyond progression because we believe it exerts downward pressure on tumor growth. Previously in hepatocellular carcinoma, it was recommended by many experts when we only had sorafenib that if the patient is doing well and tolerating it, even though you've tipped past progression, you can keep them on sorafenib, or with TKIs initially in RCC. That's fallen a little bit out of favor just because we got so many different drugs. So doctors love to kind of switch drugs. But in many places, we still don't know for sure if you're better off by switching from Coke to Pepsi versus just, continuing Coca-Cola, because a lot of these are Me Too drugs. The other role of progression-free survival, I mean, to be honest, the largest role is as an endpoint in clinical trials. It has changed the landscape of clinical trials. It's gotten many drugs to market. But the clinical uses, so that's the other use. And there, I think it can be used a lot less. I'll give you an example. We recently had a drug, olaparib, in germline mutant pancreas cancer. And this trial, Apollo, showed that olaparib against sugar pill extends progression-free survival. Well, I've got a lot of problems with this study. One, sugar pill is not something I'm happy giving a pancreas cancer patient. I like to give them 6 cycles of FOLFOX therapy and then 5-FU indefinitely. I like to give them therapy indefinitely. And, that's what most oncologists like. So depriving them of therapy to give them this straw man control arm, I think, is unfair. The next thing is, the median survival in this study is 18 months, which is not good enough for our patients. It's a tragedy. You have a 50-year-old person in your office. They have 18 months to live. That's a deep tragedy. In that case, do you really even need a surrogate endpoint? I want a drug that improves 18 months to 24 months to 30 months. Get me that drug. Don't get me a drug that improves PFS and doesn't change OS one lick, which is what olaparib does. So I think, we use it way too much, and that is largely driven by the pharmaceutical companies, I think.
And let's talk about post-marketing surveillance studies and some of the research you've done in that area. So the FDA approval, drugs that had received accelerated approval. Part of the issues that you bring up in the book is often when they receive the accelerated approval, they often test the same surrogate endpoint instead of overall survival. Can you talk a little bit about that research and put that in context for our viewers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we talked about the philosophy of accelerated approval. When you are in an unmet medical need situation, should someone make something available to you? And I agree. But here's the caveat. At some point, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, you got to actually know if it works. I mean, I think patients deserve to know that. I think society deserves to know that, who's footing the bill. I think patients deserve to know that, who are paying for this out of their own pockets. They want to know, do you actually live longer or live better? And I think the challenge is we never know that for many drugs in life cycle. What do I mean by that? We've done studies that show that when drugs are approved based on surrogates, like we talked about progression-free survival, but the other surrogate is you don't even have a control arm. You just show you shrink the tumors in some people. We can talk about that. When you approve drugs based on these surrogates and you follow them out year after year on the market, you find very few of them actually prove they make patients live longer, live better. In one of our studies by Chul Kim and I in 2016, we found it was just 16% of drugs actually do that. Bishal Gaywali and Kesselheim, Aaron Kesselheim from Harvard Medical School, they did a nice paper in JAMA Internal Medicine where they find that sometimes the FDA says, look, we know your drug shrinks tumors, you get an accelerated approval. And then a few years later, they come back and they say, it's about time we convert this to a regular approval. And so in my mind, I would imagine they'd say, hey, show me you improve survival or quality of life. But what they do show is they say, well, here's another study that confirms we actually shrink tumors. Okay, we'll convert you to regular approval. That to me is just contradictory. If it was the case that shrinking tumors was good enough to be considered efficacy, you don't give an accelerated approval in the beginning. You can just give them a regular approval. And if it is, but if it isn't the case that shrinking tumors proves efficacy, you shouldn't use it as a confirmatory endpoint in the subsequent study. And so that to me is a fundamental contradiction at the agency. And Bishal and Aaron point out that that's up to 1 in 5 accelerated approvals. So I mean, there's many ways you can slice it, but the bottom line is this. Once the FDA gives the accelerated approval, they do a very poor job of ever ensuring that drug helps people live longer, live better. In fact, it's one of the greatest failures in regulation there is.
It's interesting currently. So recently we've just had ODAC meet and talk about the PDL1 and PD1 inhibitors, which there's a lot of them to choose from. I think there may be 7 or 8. I know that a couple companies had withdrawal for certain indications. That doesn't mean, just to be clear, that the drug itself failed. It just means for certain indications they've withdrawn their approval from the FDA, and they voluntarily did that. But there are 2, I believe, that the ODAC met and said this isn't something that we think should be approved for certain indications. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are things changing with ODAC? And then in terms of the FDA, the FDA ultimately makes that decision, but I don't think any decision has been made, which for me personally, I'm just like, we were doing a story on it in the magazine, and I was like, we'll just have to keep our eye on it, but we still don't have an answer on that. What is your sense of what's going on there with this? Because I'm not used to seeing that kind of level of scrutiny. Are things changing, or is it just because of the crowded marketplace?
Yeah, it's a great point. So, I mean, I guess let me give a little background. So, these PD1 and PDL1 drugs, these are the checkpoint inhibitors. These are the drugs that unleash the immune system, and they got a Nobel Prize for it. And I want to say off the bat that they are invaluable drugs in certain situations. I mean, we wouldn't be able to take care of the majority of patients with non-small cell lung cancer without these drugs. If you have a melanoma patient, you desperately need these drugs. I mean, these are life-saving drugs in those indications. But these drugs have over 70 indications. They have 70 different places in cancer that we give them. Those aren't all the same. I mean, they may work wonderfully for melanoma, but they don't work so well in a different tumor type, for instance. That's always been the case. And, there's no drug that works perfectly in every single tumor type, but yet they have many, many approvals. About a year ago, I think the FDA noted that they had 10 approvals that were accelerated approvals that were given on the basis of shrinking tumors, but every single randomized trial in those spaces had failed. The company had failed all the post-marketing commitments. They didn't improve survival. They didn't improve quality of life. They didn't improve anything that really matters to patients. They called them the 10 dangling approvals. And so I think the first thing they did was they approached the company and said, what do you want to do about this? And 4 of the 10, they voluntarily withdrew from market. But I think they did so with a gun to their head. If you're not going to do it, what are we going to do to you? We might pull the approval. So I don't think, and by the end of the story, you'll see, I think that they regretted doing that, and they are never going to do that again. Here's why. 6 of them, the company pushed back and said, you know what? We believe that even though the trials failed, those trials we promised you for the accelerated approval commitment failed, we believe that you ought to make this drug available because we've seen good responses. We have an anecdote here or there. Doctors have been comfortable with it. We think it has a role. We believe it works. And they took those 6 to the ODAC. In 4 of the 6 cases, the Oncology Drug Advisory Committee voted that we believe, despite failed negative studies, we ought to keep these on the market. In 2 of the 4, they voted to withdraw them from the market. But in one of those 2, if it weren't for Rick Pazder making an impassioned speech, I think they would have voted the other way. He basically flipped the vote, I think, at the last minute. So what does this mean to me? When the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't get it back in. You can give the doctors any drug. And if doctors get any drug and they get comfortable using it and prescribing it and giving it to their patients, we will always believe there's 1 or 2 people who benefited from it. You can give them anything. I mean, throughout the history of time, human beings are great at convincing ourselves that things we do work. That's why we did bloodletting for, 1,000 years, because we thought some smart person thought, hey, this probably does work. I've seen it work. I've seen somebody be better after you've done it. And that's how we think about things with anecdote. I mean, anecdote, I think, is the greatest misleading force in a doctor's mind. And that's why we do controlled studies. But anyway, so once the toothpaste is out of the tube, the drugs are approved, doctors who become comfortable prescribing these drugs, the ODAC, they're very unlikely to withdraw the drugs from market. And that's what we saw with the vote. The FDA has not ruled, but I'll tell you, to my knowledge, they've never ruled against an ODAC to be more restrictive. They've only ruled against them to be more lenient against the companies. So I think they'll keep those 4 on the market. They'll withdraw 2. And those 4 people who voluntarily withdrew, those 4 approvals, I think they regret it. And I don't think they'll ever do it again, because now the incentives have changed in the marketplace. If you have actually, the incentive has changed in a couple ways. I'll just say one incentive has changed is if I'm a company and I got an accelerated approval, in the old days, I had an incentive to do that confirmatory study, because if I got a positive result, I can stay on the market. And if I don't do it, they might pull me for just being delinquent. Now we have a clear message that says, you know what, even if those studies are negative, we're not going to pull you. So what's my incentive as the company? I'll tell you what, it's not to do the study or to do just a lousy job of the study. I'll accrue very poorly. I'll take a long time. I'll run out the shot clock. And you know what? You'll never pull my drug, because worst case scenario, I take you to an ODAC and I say, my trial didn't accrue. What are you going to do about that? My drug works. Obviously, I have one doctor here who said he felt it worked. And so I think we have some article coming on this soon. Fundamentally, it's a devastating finding. I think it changes. I guess it's one thing about these 10 drugs. That's one story. But the real story is, what does it do to the incentives in the marketplace around drug approvals? And that will be completely redefined in ways that I think are deeply problematic.
So for the doctor, that's confusing. For the oncologist, for the patient, that's even more terrifying. I guess, I worry when we talk that, the patient is going to think to kind of think scientists aren't in it for their improvement, or, that sort of the whole system's rigged, that they're taking drugs that potentially provide limited benefit, and they're also very desperate patients, which, you would think that you need to protect these patients. But my question, I guess, to you is, what does the patient do on that very personal physician level? And I know you treat patients. So having this information, how does the patient really broach this topic with their physician, but also knowing that the physician can't possibly know all of this, right? Does the average physician, I'm talking a lot and not asking a question, but does the average physician, I guess, understand the nuance of this? Because I'm thinking of a doctor who's, they still have the needs of their patients in mind, but they also have a lot of other things. And if they have to pick from 7 or 8 drugs, they're going to go with the one they use. So do you feel like to get to my question, do you feel like the average oncologist has enough of a knowledge to sort of go through all of this with the patient to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a profound. I mean, your comments are very profound in a few ways. I'll tell you what I think they are, and I'll give you my answer for what the patient can do about it. And the short answer to your question is no. I don't think the average doctor is equipped to do this kind of work. And when the FDA lowers their bar lower and lower and lower and just lets the marketplace flood with drugs, they basically task each individual doctor and patient to be their own FDA. Is this safe and effective in this situation? What do you think? How do you interpret the data? They're giving their burden to you. I guess one thing I want to point out is, why do we even have the FDA? Like, why not just let the companies develop whatever evidence they want and offer it to patients, and let patients and doctors make whatever choices they want? And in fact, there are some right-leaning people who libertarians in the space who think that's how it ought to be. And I think the reason we don't do that is that we acknowledge as a society that people with cancer or any debilitating disease are vulnerable and sick. And there's sometimes, there's the old proverb that a drowning man will reach for the blade of a sword, that they'll take something because they're desperate, which is actually may not be in their best interest. And that's why we have regulation. That's why we created the FDA in 60. That's why we added the efficacy requirement in 62, to protect people who are vulnerable, who don't have a lot of technical knowledge about biomedicine, to shield them from choices they might otherwise make. It's the same reason why we make you buckle up and I buckle up in the car, to shield us from a bad choice. I think the next point you made is, like, people may worry the system is rigged. I actually think that one of the deep truths about the system is that to some degree it is rigged, in the sense that the system is designed to maximize the profits of large pharmaceutical firms. That's really the primary goal of the system, and it has the added side effect of some of the products are really transformational. But the challenge for the patient, but many are marginal and some may not work at all. The challenge for the patient and the doctor is to put their finger on where it's rigged. Some drugs, if you have metastatic melanoma, the doctor offers you nivolumab. That's not a rigged thing. That's a remarkably transformative medication in that space. If you have HER2 positive breast cancer, they offer you trastuzumab. You have CML, they give imatinib. These are great drugs. But if you have relapsed colon cancer and somebody offers you regorafenib, that's a very marginal choice. And I actually struggle to believe, I don't know what the real effect is in average American people. I think that's an open question. And that to me smells like rigged. It makes a lot of money. It transfers money from insurers to pharmaceutical shareholders. But do people really get better care as a result? the answer to your question, part of why I wrote the book and part of why we do all this work and I make a podcast and have a YouTube channel is to try to teach, I think, doctors how to be better students of medical evidence. I think medical school does not prepare you. It teaches you the Krebs cycle, but it doesn't teach you how to read a study. So part of my motivation as a associate professor or somebody who teaches classes is to try to get people to do this better. But I also think that patients can come into the doctor-patient encounter and be a little bit more empowered on this topic. And here's a few things I would suggest. When people ask, when doctors suggest what we ought to do, I think patients should always ask, what if we don't do that? What if we do something else? What if we do nothing? I mean, I think you just have to always ask that question to get a sense of what would it look like if you did something different? I think the next question patients would ask is, before you had this drug, you're recommending that I have follicular lymphoma, I should get copanlisib. You recommend copanlisib. Doctor, before you had copanlisib 5-6 years ago, how did you treat someone like me? What drug did you give? And the doctor might answer. And then you might say, how do you know copanlisib was better than that older drug? Was there ever such a study? Oh no. And so then you can get into the evidence. What is the data? Is it promising? Is it unpromising? That kind of study. Then the thing I think we get seduced by, everyone gets seduced by the mechanism of action, the doctor and the patient. You want to give me selinexor, and the doctor says, yeah, this is a novel drug. We've never had a drug like it. It inhibits the nuclear export, and nuclear export is really important. Let me tell you a little bit about P53. The doctor starts talking. Okay, the patient should I think we can reorient the conversation. It's not so important how doctors think drugs work in the cell. That may be true, may not be true, but that's not the important question. The important question is, what evidence do you have that it does work? So you're offering me, selinexor and relapsed large cell lymphoma. You ever do a randomized trial of selinexor against a standard of care therapy? No? Oh, okay. That's different. What are the toxicities? What percent of people have grade 3 or 4 adverse events? Sometimes another question to ask is, what percent of people who take this drug get dose reductions? That's a clue that it's not really as smooth as you might think. If 40, 50, 60% of people are getting dose reduced, that means that there's something about that dose that's quite a stiff dose. Many of the quote unquote targeted therapies that are pills you take daily have very steep dose reductions and discontinuations that speak to their intolerability. So I think the answer to your question, I think, is complex. It's not just in oncology. We saw it with this Alzheimer's drug that everyone is up in arms about.
Mm-hmm.
The more the regulators lower their bar, they transfer their work to you, doctor patients. And I think, if I might say, there's just one last thought, which is that a lot of it would be bearable if the price of these drugs was really cheap. If the price was really cheap, I think a lot of this would sort itself out. People would conduct the studies. One of the reasons we can't conduct the studies is we can't afford the purchase price of some of these branded drugs to even run the randomized trial. We've written about that. People would do other studies, and if the price was cheap, the marketing and detailing of the newer drugs would be lower. The companies would have less incentives. So I think it's a tough landscape to be. Patients are more empowered than ever. They have access to more literature than ever. They read more than they've ever done before. That's all good. But I do think they need to ask the right questions and not be distracted by mechanisms and more focus on evidence, what is known, why this, why not that, what would happen if we did this versus that, how do you know that? Those are the questions that I would kind of gravitate to.
Yeah. Well, just talking about that, though, going through that literature, which is what I do every day, it just seems a little overwhelming for somebody who's facing metastatic cancer, for example, or something. Obviously it's their life, but it just seems like a stress that doesn't feel like it should be. Every patient needs to be an advocate for their own health, but it seems like a heavy lift for somebody battling cancer.
It's unfair. I think it's unfair. My point of view is that, if the reason I hit so hard on drug regulators is that I feel like they have abdicated their duty. Their duty is to make sure the choices sick, vulnerable, desperate people have are good choices. Those are choices that on average, if they take them, the well-being of Americans will be a little bit better with these drugs than without the drugs. If they have abdicated that responsibility, they put an untenable burden on people. I don't agree with those libertarian critics that think, we shouldn't have an FDA and just have a Yelp for drugs. I believe in progressive.
I was going to ask you about that too.
No, people say that,
It is a little better than that, right? And I do think, more people are surviving with cancer. I don't know. It seems very nefarious, the way you've described. And
Yes.
knowing people in the industry, I don't feel that people are that nefarious.
No one, let me be clear about that. Not a single person that is acting in this space is nefarious, i.e., their actual goal is to develop bad drugs that don't work. The problem with systems is systemic failure means that even when everyone is well intentioned, the net byproduct is bad. That's the problem with the drug space. I've given lectures at many pharmaceutical firms. They're very well motivated people. Maybe the parts of the pharmaceutical firm that are a little bit sleazy are the marketing side. Sometimes, we've had stories about the opioid epidemic that you hear their marketing tactics. You will raise an eyebrow and say, should you really have enticed doctors to prescribe oxycodone in that way? I don't think so. But most people in drug development are good people who are seeking good drugs. It's the regulators, it's the policymakers, it's the bills, it's the way money flows through lobbyists that have created a system that incentivizes the pursuit of marginal or potentially ineffective drugs at tremendous profit. And then the other point I make to your point, Marcy, which is I agree with you. There is progress in oncology, no doubt about it. There are some drugs today that I have that I didn't have 5 years ago that I'm so grateful for. But one of the challenges in the system is every time they bring out one really transformational drug, you can slip through 3 drugs that don't work so well. And that's just the nature of systems because people see the aggregate better effect. They don't know that 1 is doing all the heavy lifting and 3 are just kind of riding on. And that likely happens in the drug space. We have, for every imatinib, we have a Lartruvo, olaratumumab. That's been pulled off the market. We have checkpoint inhibitors work wonderfully in melanoma, but do they work so well in all these other indications? Olaparib has a role, and we're learning more in germline mutant breast cancer. But does it work in germline mutant pancreas cancer? Is it really better than if I had just given 5-FU and proper chemotherapy in the Polo trial? I don't know the answer to that question. So I think that's what makes this ripe for gaming. That's what makes it, because some things are successful, people can push through things that are not successful. And that's why society will bear it.
So in some ways it happens, right? It's not something you're calling out all of these issues, but in some ways you have to accept with progress, there's going to be these other outliers that are just along for the ride. I guess what the solution, I think I had asked you this question when we first talked, where you see where we get the most bang for the buck would be sort of with the FDA and then just sort of raising the bar. Do you see accelerated approvals as part of that process still, like in your ideal,
Yes. Oh, I keep it. Yeah. I mean, I guess my point of view is that you can cleave in such a way that we get the good drugs and we don't get the bad drugs. We don't get the ineffective and marginal. I think you can cut it that way. And the way you cut it is good evidence, making people do randomized trials with fair control arms. If you make somebody do a randomized trial with a fair control arm, drugs that are transformative, bortezomib, that's going to show a survival benefit, as it did, a whopping survival benefit in 16 months in myeloma. That will make it through. But drugs that don't have that benefit, drugs that have equivocal studies, maybe like a selinexor or an ELO, maybe they don't make it through. That's okay. I think so. I think that if the FDA changed their regulatory standard, you would have fewer drugs to market, but you wouldn't separate. It wouldn't be at random. The drugs that are really transformative would come through and the drugs that aren't would fail. The second order effects of that would be profound. The second order effects would change the entire industry R&D pipeline, I believe. Right now, the industry is incentivized to do thousands of studies. We have 1,000 randomized trial of PD-1 antibodies, duplicative, redundant. What do you do in a space where they're doing 6 randomized trials? 1 of the 6 is positive, 5 of the 6 are negative. Is that a real success of the drug, or is it chance alone? At some point, when you run agendas of hundreds and hundreds of studies, these large portfolios with nominal levels of statistical significance, you're going to get chance findings. We may have seen some of that with Avastin. Avastin launched, dozens and dozens of randomized trials. We tell ourselves stories like really bizarre. If you think about it, it's a really bizarre story. We tell ourselves, well, Avastin improves survival if you give it with carbotaxol in lung cancer, but if you give it with gemcitabine and cisplatin, it doesn't improve survival. Okay, that's possibility A. Possibility B is you just ran so many trials of Avastin that some are positive and some are negative by chance alone. But that's a possibility we don't consider in oncology. So I guess the answer to your question, I believe, is that you can, by changing regulation, you can incentivize companies to develop better drugs. You can get patients better options. you can actually curtail, I think, some horrendous healthcare expenditures on things that don't work, and you would have a better system. And then I'll just make one last point. We talk so much about drugs, but we forget that, if I have a metastatic colon cancer patient in my clinic who's progressed on multiple lines of therapy, and I'm thinking about a drug like Lonsurf or regorafenib, drugs with sort of very modest survival benefits and I think poor quality randomized studies with bad control arms, et cetera, and very sort of selection bias in the patients. And the real world benefit of regorafenib is probably less than in trial. That's my view. Okay, I could either take the money and give it for the regorafenib, or I could take that money and hire a home health person to go to this person's house and actually help them do dishes, help them make the bed, help them do laundry. In our society, we will never pay for that. We'll pay for that Alzheimer's drug that probably doesn't do anything before we'll pay for an aide to come to your house and care for the person with Alzheimer's. Why is that the case? I think it's the case because the Alzheimer's drug is a financial product. It takes money from society and redistributes it into the hands of few shareholders of the product. Whereas if you took that money from society and you paid for all these home health care aides for a patient with colon cancer, you are actually distributing that money in a progressive rather than regressive way. You're spreading that money out, and there's no lobbyist to spread the money out. There's the lobbyist for the shareholders of the company. And so I think that that's the fundamental imbalance. So we'll always get a regorafenib, but I'll never get my home health aide. And that to me is a tragedy, because the thing that my colon cancer patient needs is the home health aide and not really the regorafenib.
Mm-hmm. Is there, I guess, I always come back to this when I talk to you, when I read your stuff. I have metastatic breast cancer, I have metastatic whatever. I want to try every drug I can. And I know you can talk about this high theory
Sure.
kind of stuff. And to me and to a lot of people, they want to try a drug if that might save their lives. So we talked about the accelerated approval, the FDA and all that stuff. And I know you've gotten this question, but literally, how can you say to a person who has metastatic cancer who wants to try a drug, even if it's maybe negligible benefit, they want to try it? You're saying you don't want that drug to come on market. What do you say to that on a personal level, that you're dealing with that, patient to the physician?
I guess I would say that anybody who's a doctor who also does policy, you have to wear two hats, which means that when you wear your doctor hat, you sometimes prescribe those drugs. I mean, if you have an honest conversation with someone about what's known and not known, and we have a path to get them that drug and they want to do that drug, we will support that choice. You don't want the doctor in the room to be the ultimate gatekeeper. I mean, and no society that I'm aware of uses that as the strategy. In the UK, they have NICE. In Germany, they have, they have ICWIG. They have other societies. Okay, when I put my policy hat on, I see it's bad for society. But let me come back to the policy question, which is, the policy question is, well, shouldn't somebody who is sick and vulnerable be able to try anything that might help, even if that probability is low? That's the policy question. The policy answer is you don't have that system, actually. And if you wanted that system, you would abolish the FDA. I think that is much in line with these people who support the Yelp for drugs. There are many companies that are too small to be able to ever afford the bureaucracy of the FDA. They can't afford to pay, all the fees for IND, for NDA. They can't afford to pay user fees. They have small startups. If you really think that anyone should try any product of any amount of promise, why let the FDA use a response rate of 10% as the line? If I want to try a response rate of 9%, why does the FDA deny me that opportunity? But 11% is okay? I mean, and you may ask, is there an example of this? Actually, there is an example. Pembro for TMB. They set a cutoff of TMB for the use of pembrolizumab. If you go one number below that cutoff, the response rate is not zero. It's 6.8% or something. We wrote about this. And so if your argument is that I'm willing to take any risk, let the patient decide. Don't let society set any bars. Then I think you really are pushing in a direction that means that there is no value to have the FDA do anything.
But isn't that extreme? I mean, people, at least with the FDA, have a bar of evidence. It's safe. It's fairly safe and effective. Yes. I mean,
I disagree with that in a couple of ways. One, safety. I mean, when you run a small study of 50 people, you have very little knowledge of safety. Actually, you could have many drugs that have a net survival decrement with an uncontrolled study of 50 people. So I don't think you get the safety that you think, with very small. True safety only comes from very large data sets because rare safety signals can emerge. I think it's capricious. You've set a capricious bar, but imagine a patient with TMB9. Let's say I'm a patient with TMB9 versus 11. Why does the person with 11 get the right to try Pembro, but not 9? They have a 12% response rate, but 9 has a 8% response rate. So why does the FDA get to decide that 9 is not acceptable? I don't have the right to try, but 11 is acceptable. So I think that that's the problem you're going to run into. In my world, there's a solution, which is the FDA should approve it, not based on response rate, but if you actually live longer. And so if people with TMB of 10 live longer by trying it versus not having the option, and people below 10 don't, but we don't even do those studies because we're so seduced by these surrogates. So I think the answer to the question is that there will always be some line. And if we choose if we base it on a capricious metric, the people who are willing to try risk will always have a legitimate grievance about why it was set there and not lower.
Mm.
I guess, yeah, that's.
Okay. Let me just go through some questions that I had in advance. Is there anything else that I guess that you want to add that I haven't talked about?
I think interest in this topic has changed a lot, and that Alzheimer's drug has helped get attention on it. Why that Alzheimer's drug? When we talk about high drug prices, it's always two things that go into the equation. There's the price of the drug per person who gets it. In cancer, we're hitting the ball out of the park. We're 400 grand per dose, like CAR T cells. We're 200 grand a year, like many new drugs. The second part of the equation, the Alzheimer's drug is 56,000 a year. Way low. It's way cheaper than our drugs. The second part of the equation is how many people are eligible to take it. And in cancer medicine, we're talking about modest numbers of people, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, maybe 40,000. That's what we're talking about for our drugs. Pembrolizumab is going to earn, 100 billion plus life cycle and maybe over 8 billion a year because it's got so many people who are taking it potentially. That Alzheimer's drug, it's got 56,000 a year, but the second part of the equation is 6 million people. And even if you only give it to 2 million of the 6 million, you're talking about a budgetary impact that will dwarf all other Part B spending. We'll talk $100 billion in the budget will be blown out by this one drug. So what I wish to suggest is that one of the reasons why the more people have not been more outspoken about cancer drugs is that everyone thinks it's not enough budgetary impact to warrant the concern. They see the aducanumab, the Alzheimer's drug, and they see $112 billion outlay, and we get, dozens and dozens of op-eds have been written just in the last 2 weeks about how this is a misguided decision. We don't really know this drug helps people. But Alzheimer's has many of the same characteristics as cancer. People who suffer from Alzheimer's are desperate. They're willing to grasp for anything. And maybe aducanumab is the blade of the sword and they're the drowning person. But who are we to tell that person they ought not reach for it? And I think the answer is, people think that when you start talking about society spending this kind of money, we really do want to make sure that people are better off as a result.
Okay, Dr. Prasad, well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us. I'm sorry that we weren't able to do this live, but I encourage anybody who's interested in reading more to pick up the book Malignant by Dr. Prasad. And I thank you again for taking the time to talk with us. Bye-bye.